Today, I want to talk about domestic violence. In terms of calling it domestic violence versus abuse may be better suited considering that abuse doesn't always involve physical violence, and violence is not always an isolated incident. Abuse involves a pattern of behavior. It's repeated acts targeted towards another person. This is more appropriate considering that research has shown that most victims of domestic violence have experienced a history of abusive or harmful behaviors by the offender. And violence is also a form of abuse, but not only the only form of abuse. And when it comes to legal definitions, they're going to depend on how states define domestic violence, which tend to vary state to state. So to begin, I want to start with a general definition of domestic abuse and break down some key aspects of the tactics abusers use to instill power and control. So while domestic violence can be considered an isolated incident, it often occurs as a pattern of behaviors that are designed to instill power and control over others. In some cases, abusers will snap and commit some serious form of abuse, like strangulation, where as a result, victims are so terrified of the perpetrator and will subsequently comply with their demands to prevent future incidents of violence or even death. And thus sometimes the violence can occur once, or can occur in combination with other forms of sexual and psychological abuse to the point that victims are so terrified and will just ultimately comply with the abuser's demands just so that they don't ever have to experience more severe harm and or death. And so in some cases, perpetrators only have to use violence once, in addition to using other coercive tactics so that they don't have to use violence in the future. That being said, fear is not healthy when it exists in any relationship, whether that is professional, platonic, familial, or even romantic. If someone's actions make someone else fear for the safety of themselves or others, that is abuse. We also need to understand that abuse is not just physical, and abusers attempt to instill control through a number of factors, such as denigrating victims to lower their self-esteem and their autonomy, their ability to make decisions by themselves. And this can sound like, go ahead and leave me, or you're ugly and no one's ever going to love you, you're so stupid, you have a criminal record, no one's going to hire you, blah, blah, blah. Or they will humiliate victims in front of others by revealing personal information online about the victims, such like either outing their sexuality or telling others about their sexually transmitted infections or HIV status or immigration status. And this is because abuse is about power and control. And this occurs when perpetrators restrict victims' ability to make decisions for themselves. And abusers will either prevent victims from moving about their day, so like preventing them from going to work, like slashing their tires, or just forcibly making sure that they do not leave, prohibiting them from hanging out with their friends, coercing them or forcing them into sex, isolating them from family members, preventing victims from being able to see their children, getting victims fired from their jobs, destroying personal and professional reputations. And ultimately, abusive tactics, they're designed to instill power and control over victims to the point that these can because it puts victims in fear of serious bodily harm. In a number of these cases, they actually result in serious bodily harm, such as broken bones, internal injuries, disfigurements, traumatic brain injuries, as well as emotional harm and even sexual violence. Language matters, and we can also distinguish between domestic and intimate partner violence or abuse. And this is important considering that the dynamics of the harm and the motives of the abuse can actually vary depending on the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. So motives between an uncle physically abusing, his nephew might be completely different than a wife abusing her husband. Intimate partner abuse involves a pattern of harmful behaviors directed towards those in a romantic, intimate dating or a marital relationship. So this could either involve sex or just type of romantic relationship involving dating. Whereas domestic abuse is a pattern of harmful behaviors directed towards all other types of relationships that the law defines as domestic. In other words, like blood or familiar relationships, like sibling-on-sibling violence, aunts throwing glasses of wine at their nieces during Thanksgiving, to anyone who is staying in the dwelling, like roommates. Regarding legal definitions of domestic violence, these are going to vary state to state, but they generally center around two main elements, involving a relationship test and then whatever crimes are outlined in the state's domestic violence statute. So the relationship test essentially defines who qualifies as a victim of domestic violence. Usually definitions will outline blood relationships, shared parental status, or whether the involved parties are married or in an intimate relationship. In some states like Georgia, cohabitation could be a component of the relationship test, which means roommates who get into a fight could be arrested and charged with domestic violence. In Colorado specifically, whether incidents are classified as domestic violence is based on three criteria: a relationship test, whether a crime was committed against a person, property, or animal, and the specific motive for the abusive behaviors. Starting with the relationship test, Colorado defines domestic violence based on whether the victim and perpetrator are related by blood, so siblings, uncles, grandparents, or have what is described as an intimate relationship, which is tricky because what is considered an intimate relationship? Intimacy doesn't always mean something involving sex. In Colorado, intimate relationships are defined as being married or dating. And it's important to note that Colorado does not require the parties to have had sex. Colorado believes you can still be in an intimate or dating relationship without ever having sex. So, for example, you could meet up with someone on a Tinder date. There's no sexual encounters, but the Tinder date starts to engage in stalking where they repeatedly text you. They're now showing up at your job and they're starting to create fear. And so even though there wasn't any sexual relationship, the parties involved met in an intimate setting, such as a date meeting from Tinder. The second criteria is whether a crime against a person, property, or animal was perpetrated. And so this essentially requires evidence demonstrating probable cause for an arrest for any crime, property damage, battery, assault, or killing or harming an animal. I can't believe. The final criteria essentially taps into the motives underlying the abusive behaviors. So accordingly, Colorado describes that there has to be evidence that the perpetrator committed the crime against the victim for the purpose of punishing the victim, getting revenge, intimidating the victim, coercing the victim into doing something that they wouldn't normally do or didn't want to do, and or just instilling power and control over the victim. Because that is a lot to remember, I describe it as, are they acting like a prick? Are they doing this for the purpose of punishing the victim, getting revenge, intimidating them, or coercing them or controlling something about their lives? What's also important to know that in Colorado, domestic violence is treated much differently compared to other states in two ways. First, Colorado is one of a handful of states that is a mandatory arrest state. So in other words, officers do not have discretion in domestic violence calls if they have probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and the situation meets the criteria for domestic violence, the relationship test, probable cause for a crime, evidence that the perpetrator is being a prick. Officers have to make an arrest regardless of whether the victim wants the arrest. And whether the officer personally believes an arrest should happen, Colorado mandates officers to make arrest if there is probable cause for a crime, and then if it meets the criteria for domestic violence, it receives an enhancement. An enhancement, yes, that's right. The second factor that makes Colorado unique is that domestic violence is not a specific crime in Colorado. It's what's called a sentencing enhancement attached to other crimes if they occur in the context of the DV-related criteria. Here's another example. Say you are a police officer responding to a fight between neighbors. After investigating, you discover the following. The victim called to say that his neighbor, Chad, physically assaulted him by punching him in the face. The victim stated that he had recently called the police about a loud party at Chad's house. When Chad found out that the neighbor was the one who called the police, Chad came over and punched him in the face. So in this case, you determine that a crime has been committed, which is the battery or the assault, and that it was done out of revenge or punishment for snitching to the police. At this point, we have 2 out of the 3 criteria for determining whether this incident would include charges that would have a domestic violence enhancement. So even though we have 2 out of the 3 criteria, according to the relationship test, it would not be considered a domestic violence related incident, considering that Chad and the victim were just neighbors. So if convicted of assault, Chad would likely face fines and up to 6 to 18 months incarceration. Now, let's say you receive a call about a fight at Chad's house. After responding and interviewing witnesses, you determine that Chad was having a party at his house when him and his boyfriend got into an argument. After seeing his boyfriend talking to another man at the party, Chad admitted that he went into a blind rage, took a shot of Jaeger, and punched his boyfriend in the face. So in this case, the parties passed the relationship test, considered that they are in a dating relationship. And additionally, we also have witnesses to the assault and a confession from the perpetrator, which checks the criminal offense box on the DV checklist. And finally, Chad admitted that he was jealous and committed the assault to punish his boyfriend, or essentially get revenge. So due to meeting the criteria for domestic violence, Chad would not only be arrested for the assault, because it's Colorado and officers are required to, Chad would also be charged with assault with a domestic violence enhancement. So even though Chad number 1 and Chad number 2 are charged with the same crime, the domestic violence enhancement comes with much more severe punishments, such as automatic protection orders, no substance use, alcohol, drugs, relinquishing their firearms, 32 weeks of batterer intervention treatment that Chad is going to have to pay for, and the inability to get the crime expunged from your record. So in Colorado, domestic violence is treated very, very seriously, but it also begs us to understand the predicament that officers often experience in these situations, where they have to not only determine the relationship test, they have to identify probable cause to determine whether a crime occurred, but they also have to focus on that mens rea aspect of getting into the perpetrator's head to determine why they were engaging in these behaviors and whether they were doing it to be a prick.